Okay, here's where we need to pick up from the last lecture. We were talking about what are the differences between the CGL and a professional or a management liability policy. Couple things that you notice right away. Well, if you're going to do claims made, right, and that means that the claim has to actually be made during the policy period for it to be covered, you are going to need that extended reported period. The idea that, the problem is when you make a mistake here, people are going to take their time to sue. So they're not going to immediately sue you for whatever their medical expenses are, their additional medical expenses are, their lost wages. This is going to be a long developing situation. These are going to be big claims. $1 million claims are not unusual here. And that means that they're not going to suffer an injury, today and sue you a week from now. They're going to have an injury today, and then they're going to take their time to gather all their data and all their evidence. And it's going to take years to have that data and evidence, and then the lawsuit's going to be filed. So for a claims made policy to work, you really, really, really need that extended reporting time period. And so that's something you can purchase. If you're going to go with claims made, you probably have to do that. Not so bad with CGL, but professional liability, you definitely want extra time there. A couple other things that are different. When we're in these professional areas, most of the time, the general rule is that the insurance company has the right to settle the case, and you've got nothing to say about it. If they want to settle, if somebody sued you and they decide, we think you're going to lose, so we're just going to settle instead of going through court and having all those expenses, most of the time you don't have a say in that with a CGL. With professional liability, sometimes you do. And the reason is there's a reputation effect here. So if it becomes public that you were sued and you lost and you settled, that's an additional penalty in the professional liability areas because, all right, here we have a surgeon who's been sued. And that's going to stick with you forever. Everybody's going to know it. That's going to hurt your future business. So you might want some say in whether or not you settle a claim. It might be worth something to you to say, no, let's fight this one. I can't have a losing lawsuit on my record. We're going to have to fight this and see what happens. So generally, you will have some say in that. And then, of course, you're going to have to expect to bear part of the defense cost if you invoke that option. But at least you'll have the choice. In the CGL, you don't. It's just insurance company decides to settle. That's their call. Similarly, most of the time, you don't get a chance to choose your defense counsel. But the thought is, well, hey, look, you are a medical provider in this area, in this location. You know this area. You might know certain lawyers and have relationships with them, and you want to work with them. You might want to have the right to select who the defense counsel is going to be. So sometimes the way we'll do it, instead of having the insurance company run all aspects of the defense, we'll say, okay, well, you choose your defense counsel, and then our insurance limit will go towards whatever those costs are. Now, once we do it that way, it's going to come out of the limit. And that's another difference between the CGL and professional management is that usually defense costs do come out of the limit here because of these different factors. They're not completely under the insurance company's control. In the CGL, remember, defense costs are on top of the limit. And the theory is we control, as the insurance company, we control the cost here. We can settle. We choose who is going to do the work, so we can control our costs that way. If we're going to relax those two things with professional and management liability, that's fine. But then that means that those costs are actually going to have to coming out of the limit. And then also, professional liability usually does have deductibles. You almost never see a CGL with a deductible unless it's a very large company. Professional liability is going to have deductibles here. So you'll pay the first certain dollar amount, and then that means the small losses are going to be retained by the company that's got professional liability. So again, it comes back to what are the expectations? If we have a higher than normal expectation of you to be able to deliver professional services, you probably have a professional liability exposure, and it's probably going to be excluded on your CGL with an endorsement that excludes it. It's not within the CGL. There's an endorsement tacked on that says, oh, by the way, we don't insure against professional liability. So here's where you add it back. These different types of exposures are going to require special forms. So you're not going to see standard forms. Companies are going to design their own. And then we're going to have standard exclusions, but we're also going to have specialized exclusions for each line of professional liability that we write. The types of things that would be excluded under a medical malpractice policy are different from the types of things that would be excluded under a tax preparer's professional liability policy. So we'll have some standard exclusions. We'll also have some specialized exclusions. Speaking specifically about medical malpractice, physician's professional liability, same thing. It's usually coming from 4 categories. One is failure to properly diagnose. And when you think about this, I say this in all my classes, but it's the truth. We really have unfair expectations of physicians. We really do think in the U.S. that if you get sick and you go to a doctor, you're going to get better and recover. That doesn't always happen. And when it doesn't happen, the question is always raised, well, is it the doctor's responsibility? Was it something that the doctor did wrong? And the truth is, there are some situations where it just doesn't matter. Nobody's going to be able to improve the health of some situations. And then the other part of it is, people make mistakes. Doctors, we expect a lot out of them, but they're not perfect either. They're people. So they make mistakes too. It's just that their mistakes come with some pretty severe costs. So sometimes it's a failure to properly diagnose. So what usually happens is if I think I've got a claim like that, I'm going to hire a whole bunch of other physicians to try to back up my claim and say, well, how come the doctor I chose to see, how come he or she didn't do this or that or the other thing? That's what best practices would indicate. Why wasn't that done? That's how we're going to build that case. Improper surgical performance. This one is probably a little bit more straightforward. Because you'll be able to tell if, what happened is a normal, acceptable, possible adverse outcome, or if it's something that's just way out of line that you wouldn't normally expect. Sometimes you see failure to warn, and this is where the paperwork comes in, right? I mean, anytime you have a surgical procedure, there's going to be a bunch of paperwork, and it basically boils down to, I understand that this might not work. And this might have side effects, and this might cause additional problems. I understand all that. I consent anyway. That's the physician's office trying to do the best they can in terms of loss control. They're trying to make you aware that, hey, we can't promise you that everything's always going to work. This last one is a lot harder to excuse, but it happens a lot. Thousands of cases per year of leaving surgical instruments behind in the body. That's terrible. You're going to get an infection. That infection is going to go septic. Septic people can die. And that's a big problem, leaving surgical instruments behind, especially when you talk about sponges, things that are really hard to see and hard to locate once they've soaked up blood and they're in the wound. It's hard to tell what all is in there. All kinds of crazy stories here, and you don't want to think about this. We're doing a lot of loss control here. We're going to count everything, right? So we're going to count everything as we open it, all the pieces, and before we're done, we're going to try to get a count that matches up. But even though we're doing that, some stuff gets left behind, and it's thousands of cases per year that shouldn't happen at all. So loss control, whatever we can do on the front end to stop this to begin with, because on the back end, if that happens, that's going to be automatic liability. Nobody's going to say, that happens and you shouldn't be held responsible. Everybody's going to say, that's a pretty bad mix-up here, and we're going to hold you responsible for that. So those are some categories where physicians' medical malpractice, professional liability can come into play. When you're an agent or a broker, you're worried about errors and omissions. So you're worried that your client is going to come back and say, well, they didn't properly advise me on the coverage I needed from an insurance agent perspective. They didn't renew the coverages I need. They didn't tell me that I needed certain types of coverage because it was going to expire. They did a bad job telling me what the limits should have been. We talked about that before. Usually you're not going to see any bodily injury claims for professional liability. If there is bodily injury, that's probably going to come up under the agent's CGL. So I go to my insurance agent's office, I slip and fall and hurt myself. That's a CGL claim. That's not a professional liability claim, because that's common to all businesses that have premises, right? So that's usually why you don't see, for errors and omissions, you're not going to see bodily injury as a claim very often. At least not in agent broker side. Now, on the physician side with MedMal, you might. Bodily injury is common there. We mentioned before about directors and officers. Normally, if you want somebody to sit on your board, you're going to promise them that you will indemnify them against these kind of lawsuits. And the way you do that is you get D&O insurance to cover the directors and officers. Most of the time, the people filing claims are going to be the shareholders. They're going to say, hey, look, you managed this company, Enron, into the ground, and you wrecked our investment because of it. You did all kinds of fraudulent things. We're going to hold the directors and officers responsible. We're going to sue you. Okay. Well, one of the problems that you run into is deliberate dishonesty is excluded. So where you actually have fraud, D&O coverage doesn't extend to that. And we're going to have some other exclusions that are going to show up here. But that's the big one, is that shareholders are claiming that management has led the company astray and has cost the shareholders money. And these suits are on the increase. You're starting to see a lot of complaints by shareholders. And it's hard sometimes to separate honest mistakes from mistakes where there's legal liability, right? I mean, if I'm on the board of Tesla and I decide that we want to invest more money into the space exploration side and that turns out to be worthless, is that something shareholders should be able to sue for? Or is that just an honest to goodness mistake? In which case you wouldn't be able to sue for an honest to goodness mistake, just a bad decision. There needs to be an element of liability there, where you say that the average person in this position would not have done that. In other words, the management acted contrary to what a reasonable person would have done. So just losing money isn't good enough. You've got to be able to show that they behaved in a way that wasn't reasonable in order to actually win a case like this. We're usually going to have some deductibles and a coinsurance clause. And then, of course, like always, we're going to have a limit. So here's an example of how that might work. We might have $1 million limit, $25,000 deductible, and then everything beyond that, you've got to pay the first $25,000 to the deductible and then 5% on the coinsurance up to there. And you've got an example down here to show you what that is. So who's going to pay what? Well, if you had a $100,000 claim, all right, there's $25,000 deductible. Company pays that. Then they pay 5% of the rest. So the rest is $75,000. They pay 5% of that. That's $3,750. The insurance company is going to pay $75,000 minus $3,750, $71,250. The math here is not too hard. It's just understanding that the coinsurance applies to the covered claim after you've subtracted the deductible. Pretty straightforward otherwise. We've got a whole category of losses here that we have to worry about called employment practices liability. So here's some of the examples of what employment practices liability might look like. Wrongful termination and failure to hire. Sexual harassment. Again, we talk about the hostile working environments. And that kind of blends into defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Unlawful discrimination. Yeah, if you're accused of that, you're going to need an employment practices liability policy to help defend you against that. Most of the time, this is going to be claims made. And here you can buy extended reporting time. Here it's usually 1 to 3 years on that endorsement. So it's not all the way up to 5 like we saw on some of the others. The advantage of this, if there is one, is normally when something has gone wrong here. Usually you do get sued fairly quickly. So these are not going to stretch out for as many years as some of the other types of liability, like professional liability for a physician. That's going to have an extremely long tail. This is still liability. Liability always has long tails, but it's the arguing part of it, not the time between the injury and the lawsuit, where the time really takes place. And so that's, if there is a silver lining, that is something that's you could point to there. And then we have employee benefits liability, fiduciary liability. So particularly with pension and retirement plans, and particularly in a pension, if I'm the employer and I'm managing the pension, I have to do that in a way that ultimately benefits my employees. If I'm making decisions that hurt my employees, particularly with investment selection. So some employers will tell you, hey, you need to choose your own investments because they don't want the liability. I mean, yeah, I'm going to tell you, if you come to me and say, what's the smartest thing to do? I'm going to say 99% of people should invest in the S&P index and be done with it. And the same amount every paycheck. Don't ever look at how the market is going up or down. Don't try to time. Don't do any of that. If you're just going to ask me as a person, that's what I'm going to tell you. If you ask me as your employer, I'm going to say, nope. You need to talk to a financial advisor because I want them to have the liability, the fiduciary liability. I don't want you coming back and blaming me saying, hey, you told me to pick this investment and I should have done something else. What if I am not providing good advice? This is a big problem with employee benefits. Are you going to make the decision for other people or even help them make their decisions about what their benefit selections ought to be? Most companies are extremely reticent to do that. I'm scared to give you an opinion because what if it turns out to be wrong? Which health insurance plan should I pick? Pick this one. Well, I would have been way better off if I'd have picked the other one. You don't know ahead of time because you don't know what's going to happen. So if they have a choice, most companies are going to put it right back on the employee and say, you need to make the choice, which is maybe a little frustrating as an employee. But this is one of many cases where employers are primarily concerned about avoiding liability. And one way to avoid liability is to not take responsibility. And you have to decide for yourself what you're going to do. Just straight up mistakes. All right, I promised I was going to match 5% of everybody's salary in their retirement plan. And somewhere along the way when I'm doing the calculations, I just mess it up. Well, yeah, I'm going to be liable for that. And if there's missed earnings because I under contributed, yep, I'm going to be liable for that. That's employee benefits liability. Okay, switching gears entirely, I want to talk about aircraft insurance for just a bit. I mean, this is pretty different because it's pretty specific. Yeah, I think on second thought, with what we have left to cover here, I should make that its own lecture. So we'll stop here. We'll pick up with aircraft insurance on the next one, and then we can talk about aircraft insurance. We can talk about surety bonds. I'd rather not end up with a 40-minute lecture here. I'd rather have 220s if we can do it that way. So this one's a tiny bit short, and we'll go from there. Questions on this stuff up to here with professional liability, let me know and we'll answer those as best we can. Thanks a lot.